In this gripping testimony, witness how Aisha Rafiq, a devout Muslim for 47 years, saw the terrifying truth about the afterlife during her near-death experience. What she discovered changed everything she believed about religion, salvation, and eternity. Her story will shake you to your core. I never thought I'd be sharing this story. For 47 years, I lived in Mississauga, Ontario, devoted to Islam with every fiber of my being. I prayed 5 times daily, fasted during Ramadan, and even completed the Hajj twice. My life revolved around my faith, my family, and my work as a pharmacist. Looking back now, I see how different everything was. My husband Kareem and our 3 children were pillars of the Muslim community. I led women's Quran study groups at our local mosque, volunteered at Islamic charity events, and spent countless hours studying Islamic theology. I thought I knew the truth. I was certain of it. That certainty began crumbling one ordinary evening while I was doing inventory at my pharmacy. I'd been having strange symptoms for weeks, unexplained bruising, constant fatigue, and nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. I'd brushed them off, thinking it was just stress from working too hard. That night, as I was counting bottles of medication, I noticed my gums were bleeding. Not just spotting, but really bleeding. My coworker Nancy found me in the bathroom, trying to stop the bleeding. "Aisha, you need to go to the hospital right now," she insisted, her face pale with worry. I remember feeling annoyed at her concern. I was a healthcare professional. I would know if something was seriously wrong, wouldn't I? But Nancy wouldn't let it go. She called Kareem to pick me up, and within an hour, I was sitting in the emergency room. The doctors moved with alarming speed once they saw my symptoms and ran some initial tests. Words like platelets and bone marrow flew around me. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. The diagnosis came like a thunderbolt: acute promyelocytic leukemia, an aggressive form of blood cancer. My platelet count was dangerously low, putting me at risk for catastrophic bleeding. The doctors explained that without immediate treatment, I could suffer a fatal brain hemorrhage or other internal bleeding. Treatment began that night. I was admitted to the oncology ward and started on a complex protocol of chemotherapy and other medications. The first few days were a blur of needles, transfusions, and worried faces. Kareem tried to stay strong, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Our children, Zara, Imran, and little Yasmin, visited when they could, but the sight of their mother hooked up to so many machines was too much for them to handle for long. My imam came to visit, offering prayers and reassurance. He told me this was Allah's test and that I needed to remain steadfast in my faith. I clung to those words, reciting prayers in Arabic between bouts of nausea and pain. The Quran verses I'd memorized over decades became my constant companions during sleepless nights. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on day 5 of my treatment. My blood pressure had been unstable all day, dropping dangerously low despite the medications the nurses were giving me. I felt weaker than I'd ever felt before, like my very life force was seeping away. The doctors later told me I had developed DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation, a life-threatening condition where blood starts clotting throughout the body while also causing severe bleeding. I remember the room spinning, the lights becoming too bright, then too dim. I could hear the monitors beeping frantically and nurses rushing in. Kareem was there, holding my hand, saying something I couldn't quite make out. Then everything went black, and my journey to the other side began. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just any silence, but a complete absence of sound that felt almost solid. One moment I was in my hospital bed, and the next I was floating above my body. The scene below me was chaos. Doctors performing chest compressions, nurses running with equipment, my husband being ushered out of the room. But I couldn't hear any of it. I wasn't scared, which surprised me. Instead, I felt a profound sense of peace. My body, which had been racked with pain and weakness, was now gone. I was pure consciousness, observing everything with perfect clarity. The fluorescent hospital lights didn't hurt my eyes anymore. In fact, I could see better than I ever had before, noticing details I'd never picked up on: the subtle patterns in the ceiling tiles, the individual threads in the nurses' scrubs. Then came the tunnel. Everyone talks about the tunnel, but nothing could have prepared me for what it actually felt like. It wasn't dark like I'd imagined. Instead, it was made of pure light, but not light as we know it. This light had substance, intelligence, purpose. It pulsed with life and drew me forward with gentle but irresistible force. As I moved through this tunnel, my entire life began playing around me in vivid detail. But it wasn't just a simple replay. I experienced every moment from multiple perspectives. I saw how my actions had affected others, even in ways I'd never realized. Every kindness I'd shown rippled outward, touching lives I'd never known about. But I also saw my failures, my moments of selfishness, the times I'd chosen to look away from others' suffering. What struck me most was seeing my religious devotion from this new vantage point. All those years of praying 5 times a day, fasting, giving zakat, I saw now that my sincerity had been real. I truly had been seeking God. But I also saw something that shook me to my core. I had been sincere, but sincerely wrong. The light around me grew brighter, and I began encountering other souls. Some were moving forward like me, while others seemed to be drifting downward into darkness. With a shock of recognition, I saw my grandfather who had passed away years ago. But he wasn't as I remembered him. His spiritual form revealed his true nature. He was shrouded in shadow, his face contorted in anguish. He tried to speak to me, to warn me, but no words came out. Yet somehow I understood what he was trying to say. He had followed the same path I had, devoted to Islam until his last breath. Now he was facing the consequences of that choice. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Everything I had believed about salvation was wrong. More souls appeared around me, thousands of them. Many were Muslims I had known in life, imams, religious teachers, devoted worshippers. They were all descending into that terrible darkness. Their faces showed the same horrible recognition I had just experienced, the understanding that they had built their lives on a false foundation. But it wasn't just Muslims. I saw Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, and others, all facing the same fate. The truth was brutally clear. There was only one path to salvation, and we had missed it. Each soul's destination was determined not by their sincerity or good works, but by whether they had accepted the real truth. Then came the most difficult vision of all. I saw Muhammad, the prophet I had revered all my life. But I didn't see him as the noble messenger I had always imagined. Instead, I saw him as he truly was, a deceiver who had led countless souls astray. The weight of this revelation was almost unbearable. Generations of my family, millions of devoted followers, all led down a path that ended in darkness. As I continued through the tunnel, the light began to change. It became more personal, more conscious. I could feel love radiating from it, but not the abstract, distant, divine love I had imagined in my Islamic faith. This was intimate, immediate, and overwhelmingly real. I knew, with a certainty that transcended mere belief, that I was in the presence of Jesus Christ. His presence was nothing like the Islamic view of Isa I had been taught. This wasn't just a prophet or a holy man. This was God himself, one with the Father and the Holy Spirit, yet distinct in his personality. The truth of the Trinity, which I had rejected as blasphemous all my life, was suddenly crystal clear. The presence of Christ grew stronger, and suddenly I was standing before what I can only describe as a throne of light. The being seated there was both terrifying and beautiful beyond words. This wasn't Allah as I had imagined him, distant and unknowable. This was personal, real, and his love was overwhelming. Yet there was also perfect justice in his presence. My life began playing out again, but this time it was different. Every deed, every thought, every intention was laid bare. I saw how I had taught my children to reject Christ, leading them away from true salvation. Each time I had convinced someone to embrace Islam felt like a stone around my neck. The good works I had been so proud of, my charity, my kindness, my religious devotion, meant nothing without the foundation of true faith. Then came something I hadn't expected. I saw souls arriving from earth, people who had just died. Many were Muslims, confident they were heading to paradise. I watched their faces as they discovered the truth. Some fell to their knees in recognition and repentance, even at that late hour. Others turned away in anger and denial, choosing darkness over admitting they had been wrong. A group of Muslim scholars I had deeply respected in life appeared. These men had spent their lives teaching Islamic doctrine. Now they stood trembling as they faced the reality they had denied. Their extensive knowledge of Islamic theology, their memorization of the Quran, their careful adherence to Sharia, none of it mattered. They had rejected the only name under heaven by which people can be saved. The most haunting part was seeing the young ones, teenagers and children who had died believing in Islam. Their confusion and fear as they faced judgment was almost unbearable to watch. Many cried out in Arabic, reciting the Shahada, but those words that I had thought were the key to paradise now echoed emptily in the vastness of eternity. I saw something else that shook me. Souls of Christians who had compromised their faith by teaching that all religions led to God. They had known the truth but chose to water it down, leading others astray in the name of tolerance. Their judgment was particularly severe because they had known better. Time didn't work normally in this place. I could somehow see past, present, and future simultaneously. I witnessed countless souls throughout history facing this same judgment. The pattern was clear and unchanging. Salvation came through Christ alone. No amount of sincerity, good works, or religious devotion could change this fundamental truth. I was shown more about Muhammad, seeing events from his life from a heavenly perspective. I saw how he had twisted and distorted the truth about Jesus, leading billions down a false path. The Quran, which I had believed was divine revelation, was shown to me for what it really was, a clever deception that mixed truth with lies just enough to be convincing. But this judgment wasn't just about exposing error. It was about love. I understood that God hadn't sent these visions to condemn, but to save. Each soul was precious to him, and he desired none to perish. The exclusivity of salvation through Christ wasn't about divine favoritism, but about the very nature of reality. Just as there are absolute physical laws that govern the universe, there are absolute spiritual laws that govern eternity. The scene shifted, and I was shown the true nature of hell. It wasn't the Islamic concept of Jahannam I had believed in. This hell was far more terrifying, a place of eternal separation from God's presence, filled with unimaginable torment and literal, unquenchable fire. I could see flames engulfing the souls who had rejected Christ, their screams filling the air in anguished chorus. This was a suffering beyond any earthly comprehension, and there was no escape from these all-consuming flames. I saw souls in agony, consumed by fire that burned but never destroyed, their pain unending. I saw souls who had chosen to follow Muhammad's teachings descending into these flames. They writhed in pain, calling out for mercy, but they had made their choice in life to reject the truth of Christ. The torment wasn't just physical. It was spiritual and emotional, the unbearable sorrow of knowing they had separated themselves from God forever. What broke my heart was the awareness that this fiery punishment was completely avoidable. Christ's sacrifice had already paid the price for everyone's salvation. The way to heaven was open to all who would accept it. Yet billions were choosing hell by rejecting this gift, clinging to false religions and empty philosophies instead of embracing the truth. In the midst of this overwhelming judgment scene, everything shifted. I found myself being drawn into what I can only describe as the heart of heaven itself. The light became even more intense, but instead of blinding me, it seemed to open my spiritual eyes wider. Here, I encountered Jesus in an even more personal way. I saw his crucifixion from heaven's perspective. Every lash, every thorn, every nail was endured with me, and every other soul in mind. The depth of his love was unfathomable. This wasn't just a prophet dying a martyr's death as I had been taught in Islam. This was God himself, taking on human flesh, bearing the weight of all sin. The truth of his deity was undeniable in this realm. Then came a series of revelations that demolished everything I had believed about salvation. I saw how the Islamic emphasis on earning paradise through good works was completely backwards. No amount of prayer, fasting, or charity could bridge the gap between human sinfulness and divine holiness. Only Christ's sacrifice could do that. The 5 pillars of Islam, which had been the foundation of my religious life, crumbled before this greater truth. I was shown how the sacraments of the Orthodox Church, baptism, chrismation, confession, communion, weren't just empty rituals, but actual channels of divine grace. These were the true means of connecting with God, not the mechanical prayers and movements I had performed 5 times a day. The Eucharist, which I had dismissed as a form of idolatry, was revealed as the literal presence of Christ, sustaining believers with his own life. More souls continued arriving as I watched. I saw Muslims I had known personally facing their moment of truth. Some had died in terrorist attacks, convinced they were martyrs for Allah. Their shock upon discovering they had murdered innocents in the name of a false god was devastating to witness. Others were ordinary believers like I had been, sincere but sincerely wrong, now facing an eternity separated from the God they thought they had been serving. What struck me most was seeing how the Islamic concept of Allah had blinded us to God's true nature. We had worshipped a deity who was ultimately unknowable, whose will was arbitrary, who demanded submission but offered no true intimacy. Now I saw God as he really is, a trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, existing in perfect love and inviting humanity into that relationship. The deception of Islam was exposed layer by layer. I saw how it borrowed elements of truth from Judaism and Christianity, but twisted them just enough to lead people astray. The Jesus of the Quran, Isa the prophet, was a pale shadow of the true Christ. By denying his deity and his sacrifice on the cross, Islam had cut off its followers from the only path to salvation. But even in the midst of this terrible revelation, I witnessed something beautiful. Souls who had lived and died as Muslims, but had somehow sensed that something was missing, who had secretly yearned for more than Islam could offer, were being drawn to Christ. Their hearts had been prepared, even if their minds had been bound by false teaching. I was shown Orthodox churches around the world, where the fullness of Christian truth was preserved. These weren't just buildings or religious institutions. They were hospitals for the soul, where the medicine of immortality was dispensed through the sacraments. The apostolic succession, the ancient liturgies, the icons, the prayers of the saints, all of it was alive with spiritual power I had never imagined. Time seemed to stretch and compress in strange ways. I witnessed centuries of Orthodox Christian martyrs who had died rather than deny Christ, their faithfulness shining like stars in the heavenly realm. Their suffering hadn't been in vain. Each martyr's death had planted seeds that would later bloom into faith for others. Suddenly, I was back in my body. The hospital room came into focus, and I could hear the steady beep of monitors. Doctors were standing over me, looking relieved. I learned later that I had been clinically dead for 7 minutes. They called it a miracle that I had no brain damage after being gone so long. But the real miracle was the transformation that happened in my heart. I knew I could never return to Islam. The truth I had seen was too real, too overwhelming to deny. The hard part was telling my family. Kareem was the first to notice the change in me. I wasn't doing my daily prayers anymore, and my Quran lay untouched on the shelf. When I finally told him about my experience, he was devastated. "You've let your illness affect your mind," he said. "Shaitan has deceived you." Our children were equally confused and upset. Zara, our eldest, refused to speak to me for weeks. Imran accused me of betraying our heritage. Only little Yasmin seemed open to listening, though she didn't understand much of what I was saying. The Muslim community's reaction was even harder to bear. Friends I'd known for decades now treated me like a pariah. My imam came to visit, trying to convince me I'd been deceived by a false vision. Women who had attended my Quran studies now crossed the street to avoid me. The loneliness was crushing at times, but as I lost my old community, I gained a new one. I found an Orthodox church whose priest helped me understand what I had experienced. The divine liturgy brought me to tears the first time I attended. It was like a piece of the heaven I had witnessed. Through catechism classes, I learned the depth and richness of Orthodox Christianity, so different from the mechanical rituals of my former faith. My physical healing paralleled my spiritual journey. The leukemia went into remission, defying the doctor's initial prognosis. Each clear blood test felt like another confirmation of God's grace. I knew He had allowed my illness as a way to reveal Himself to me. Gradually, small miracles began happening in my family. Yasmin started asking questions about Jesus, real questions that showed she was thinking deeply. Imran, while still angry, admitted that he'd always struggled with certain aspects of Islamic teaching. Even Zara began softening, especially after her first child was born, and she started contemplating questions of eternity. Kareem remained resistant, but I saw changes in him too. He couldn't deny the peace and joy he saw in me, so different from my previous religious intensity. Sometimes I would catch him watching me pray my new prayers, a thoughtful look on his face. Today, 5 years later, I'm fully healed in body and soul. I've been chrismated in the Orthodox Church, taking the name Christina. Some of my Muslim friends have secretly reached out, admitting their own doubts and asking questions about my experience. I share my story carefully, knowing how much is at stake for them. My near-death experience showed me that the truth about eternity is both simpler and more profound than I had imagined. It's not about following rules or earning divine favor. It's about accepting the love that has been offered to us through Christ and His Church. I pray daily for my Muslim brothers and sisters to have their own eyes opened before it's too late. The journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth every painful step. When I receive the Eucharist now, I taste the reality of heaven I witnessed during those 7 minutes of death. And I know, with unshakable certainty, that I'm finally on the true path home. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible testimonies of God's grace. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our new uploads. Your support helps us share these life-changing stories with others who need to hear them.